Okay, so what we're going to talk about is how we're going to be using some of these terms. We're going to talk about the definition of each of these terms, the distinctions between them as well. It's very common for us to be familiar with these terms and to feel like we understand them, but actually being able to practice them with some degree of skill and to know when we're summarizing versus when we're paraphrasing, that's another story altogether, right? So in the reading last night, Rules for Writers talked a little bit about summary, paraphrase, quoting, citing, etc. And what I'd like to do is just have us, as a class, fill out the definitions, right? And some of you will offer a definition. It'll be kind of partial. We'll need to add more to it. That's completely normal. So let's go ahead and start. If, for example, I ask you to summarize and evaluate 2 articles on your topic, as I'll be doing for the first paper in this class, what am I asking you to do? What does it mean to summarize something? Anything? Yeah?
To condense the main points of the article.
Okay, good. To condense the main points of an article, book, video, whatever it may be, right? Okay. What else? What would you add to that? Yeah.
In your own words.
Great. In your own words. Good. Anything else?
Objectively.
Good. With objectivity. Great. So objectively, put in your own words a condensed version of the main points of an article. Right? Anything else? We've done pretty well. What's that? Anything else? Okay. So let's talk about what it means to paraphrase. If summarizing is condensing the main points of an article in your own words with objectivity, what does it mean to paraphrase something? If I say when you're summarizing your 2 articles in this first assignment, you might find yourself paraphrasing here and there. What does that mean?
To restate a sentence or article in your own words without making it shorter or taking out any ideas.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So notice I put one phrase of what she said in parentheses, or article. It's pretty unusual for us to paraphrase an entire article. So her first instinct was correct, right? Most of the time when you're paraphrasing a sentence. You're paraphrasing a section of something. You rarely paraphrase an entire article. But it is also, in your own words, you have the main ideas. It should also be objective. Just going to put that in parentheses there. So the difference here is, let's say we have a 10-page article. We might summarize it in 1 paragraph. Okay. If we're paraphrasing, we might have a 2-sentence section, and we paraphrase it in about 2 sentences. We might be able to paraphrase it in 1, right? But the relationship of size is pretty even, right? It's sort of a 1-to-1 relationship of size versus a 10-to-1 relationship of size, okay? So one of the things, how many of you feel like you struggle with summarizing? Sometimes. It depends on the article, probably, right? But one of the reasons students struggle with summarizing is that their tendency is to try to paraphrase the entire article, right? And so what they're doing is they're looking at 3 or 4 sentences of the article, and they're trying to put those 3 or 4 sentences in their own words, and then they're looking at 3 or 4 more sentences, trying to put it in their own words. They're really trying to paraphrase the whole thing. A better way to approach a summary is to make a list of the 5 or 6 most important points it makes, and start from your list, right? And that's going to make it a lot easier. So let's talk about what it means to quote then. So if summarizing and paraphrasing both involve putting the main points in your own words and doing so objectively, what does it mean to quote? If I say I want you to quote at least one of your articles in this first paper, what are you going to do?
Yeah, like take out a direct line or phrase that someone had written or said.
It could be sentences. Good. So you're using a direct line, phrase, sentences from an article, using exactly their words. Great. Excellent. Anything else? Is it possible to quote non-objectively?
You could kind of point it towards one direction if you change the signal phrase, but
Right.
you're using the author's words though.
Right. If you're using the author's words, you are presenting that author's words the way that author has presented them. The signal phrase could certainly spin them away from objectivity. You could say something like, David Halperin has the gall to suggest that, right? You're setting this up as this person is saying something kind of audacious, right? Okay, excellent. So let's talk about what it means to cite. Talked about the difference between summary and paraphrase. Actually, I want to use a different color here. Summary and paraphrase are often confused with each other, and quoting versus citing can sometimes be confused with each other as well. So I want to make sure we distinguish those two things. If I say that I'd like you to cite your sources, what does that mean?
Including the page number it was found and what text it was found in, or what
Okay.
medium it was found in.
Okay. So and so this gets complicated. So include maybe author and page number, text, medium, and we'll get to that in a second. Doug, did you want to add to that?
I was going to say just giving the author credit anytime you use any of their ideas.
Okay, good. Giving author credit. Okay, great. So, in distinguishing between these two things, a quote is going to look like this, right? Writing in quotation marks. A citation is going to look like this, right? Okay, so just visually understanding the difference between those two things. One of the reasons let's go back up. So which of these things, summaries, paraphrases, and quotations, require a citation? Now I'm throwing all these words at once, and you see how it gets kind of like, yeah.
They all would.
Okay. Why does a summary need a quotation or citation? It's in your own words.
Because you're using the author's idea. You're basically saying what the author's saying in
Right.
in your own words. So if you're using what the author wrote, then you need to cite it.
Right. If you're referring to what they wrote, even if it's all entirely in your own words, you need to cite it, right? So you have to cite a summary because you are referring to something that somebody wrote. What about a paraphrase? You need to cite a paraphrase because
Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
same thing except it's even more focused, right? You're referring to a specific part of it, yeah.
It's the author's idea, not necessarily yours.
Right. So you have to cite a paraphrase because it's a specific sentence, a specific section, and probably a particular turn of, I don't want to say turn of phrase, but a particular turn of logic, right, that you find useful. And so you need to cite that. And then obviously you have to cite a quotation, right, because it's the author's words. So no matter what you use from a source or how you use it, you have to cite it. many students have learned that if they say Halpern 34 after a quotation, they've cited that source, it's good. If I say Halpern 34 after I've used the words of Halpern, is that sufficient?
No.
You need also,
Page number and
right, well you need the page number, you need quotation marks around the part that was quoted, and then you also need the work cited, which would give you the full bibliographic information. What I was looking for there was a little bit of a leading question, was this part here. I've had a lot of students suggest that they thought this was how you cite something that you're quoting, and that if you're summarizing, you don't need to have any citation at all. So remember that regardless of how you're using the source, you have to have the author name and page number. If there is no author, then it's article title. We'll get into those details on Thursday. If you're quoting, you also need the quotation marks. The only thing that signifies the words are not your own is quotation marks. Otherwise, we assume that you're summarizing or paraphrasing. Questions about any of this? Yeah.
So the works cited, is that kind of a combination between like foot and endnotes and a bibliography?
Yeah, a works cited is basically a bibliography. We're going to talk more about that on Thursday, and I'll show you the variations and how we migrated from the footnote concept and the endnote concept to the bibliography concept, just culturally, how we made that shift. But the next part, so this is the citation, is basically a way of leading you to the last page of the document where you've got the full bibliographic information. So here, all we know is Halpern 34. When we get to the bibliography, we see Halpern, comma, David, ancient Greece culture of ancient Greece, and then the city of publication and all that information that's above. So, good. Other questions? How many of you feel like, okay, some of this was familiar, but some of it you didn't really understand? It's completely normal, right? So when we're talking in here about plagiarism, which we'll talk about tomorrow, when we're talking in here about works cited and MLA rules, when we're talking about your assignments, we'll be using these terms, and we'll be using them pretty quickly, right? I once had a student ask me whether it was possible to have too many citations in an English 102 final paper. And I said, well, it's a research paper. You could have 4 or 5 citations per page. That would not be that unusual. She was picturing quotations. So is it possible to have too many citations in an English 102 paper? Probably not. I mean, theoretically, yeah. But is it possible to have too many quotations in a paper?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? I had another student, I said, you're using way too many quotations in this paper. She took out the quotation marks. This is a long time ago, before I started doing this. Actually, she's the inspiration for today's lecture. And I was like, oh, no. Now, you still have quotations, you're just not putting them in quotation marks, which means you plagiarized, right? So the key is when we start talking about things, when we talk about summarizing, when we talk about quoting, how many quotes you got, I want you to use at least one quote, when you have to cite, you want to make sure that you are picturing the right thing, right? If I say, for example, that every time you use a source you have to cite it, you should be picturing the parenthetical citation, not quotation marks. I've heard that confusion too. You said every time we used a source we had to cite it, so I'm using quotations every time I use a source. No, you have to cite it every time you use it, not quote it every time you use it. We can kind of chuckle a little bit, but you can see how this could happen. The words are similar enough, and when we start, flying through some of these things, talking about assignment descriptions, etc., you can get confused, and it can happen pretty quickly. All right. Any other questions about any of this? Oh, we haven't gotten to evaluate. Let's get to that. Okay, so this is all about using sources, but one of the reasons we use sources is so that we can talk about them in terms of our own ideas as well, right? So this first assignment, the research review, will ask you to summarize and evaluate, and we'll go over the paper in a little bit today, Well, it will ask you to summarize and evaluate 2 articles. What does it mean to evaluate an article? How would you define that term? Yeah.
To decide how reliable it is.
Okay, good. What else?
You're using your own judgment.
Okay. What else? Anything else? Reliability, its value. What are some of the things that might go into determining whether an article is valuable? Yeah.
If you even have a use for it.
Okay.
What you're writing.
Right. Is it useful for you? Is it relevant enough, and does it help you do what you want to do? Yeah.
Credible.
Credible? Yep. What else?
Timely.
Good. Let's say I have an article about the imminent social crisis likely as a result of the Y2K bug. How many of you even remember what that is? Only people over 35. Probably not timely. If you're writing about the history of technology and the fear we have associated with technology, it might be relevant. But this was the theory that when we reached the year 2000, all the computers were going to go awry because they would think it was the year 1900 because we were only using 2 digits for years instead of 4. And so everyone was like preparing for Y2K. They thought the grid was going to go down, right? It's not a particularly timely article. Didn't happen, right? Just didn't happen. So timeliness is an important criteria to evaluate. What else? Anything else? Maybe it's depth, right? That kind of gets into usefulness maybe a little bit. There's credibility, there's also accuracy, which are not always the same. Sometimes something looks credible, but you find that it's not particularly accurate, right? So credibility seems to relate more to the author and the author's credentials, maybe even the periodical itself. But accuracy, you really have to dig into the content.
It's like sort of searching for bias.
That's another one. So it could be bias. It could just be incorrect information, right? But looking for bias and objectivity, that's useful also. I'm trying to think. You know, there's some things that get debated, right? Like, so let's say the value of wine for cardiovascular health, right? You hear something one week that says it's really helpful. You hear something the next week that says it isn't. And if you had an article that talked about the importance of wine as a sort of way of relaxing and improving your cardiovascular health, and it didn't really acknowledge that it's debated, right? That would be inaccurate. It might be biased. It would be biased if it came from the Ernest and Julio Gallo winery or something like that. If it came from the American Medical Association, it might just be too brief to be accurate, right? It might just be like almost like a Twitter feed instead of some kind of an in-depth article. Other things in terms of credibility and accuracy can have to do with things like sample size. So let's say you had an article that talked about the value of using coral as a source of calcium to prevent bone loss. Okay, coral has a different kind of calcium than cow's milk does, for example. And let's say you had an article that showed that women who used coral supplements instead of calcium from milk supplements had less bone loss. But they did this study in Japan using 200 women who were from a particular town, and they compared them to 200 women who were from a particular town in the United States. Well, you've got a sample size of only 400 people. That's not a whole lot, right? You've also got 2 different populations in terms probably of ethnicity, right? and Asian American women are much less likely to have osteoporosis than upper Midwestern women who come from Northern European ancestry, right? And so you've got this issue with your sample. It looks like good research, might not be as thorough as it could be. It's probably a little tentative, right? All of those things are good things to evaluate. Now this is all a little bit different from response. Sometimes your teachers will say, I want you to write a summary and response. How many of you have been asked to write a summary and response? A response is usually your reaction and your opinion, right? And that's a little bit different. That's just, this person thinks this, I think that, right? That's not evaluating the article. Evaluating the article means taking the article on its own terms and deciding how valuable it is, regardless of what your opinion is. So realistically, you can evaluate an article objectively. Okay? We tend to think, well, this is where we kind of put in our opinion, and this is where we show our biases. You can evaluate something objectively. I can objectively look at that coral versus cow's milk study and say objectively, there are problems with this sample. I'm not being biased in saying there are problems with this sample. I'm acknowledging a statistical problem, a problem in their research process, right? So when you evaluate, you want to be as objective as possible in your evaluation. For example, let's say you found a Wikipedia article, right? And you could say, well, I have some issues with credibility, there is no author, and for the most part, Wikipedia isn't well respected. However, this article seems to cite some good sources, it's useful. I don't detect any signs of bias in it. I don't detect any inaccuracies based on other things I've read. So while Wikipedia may not in general be a good source to use, this particular article doesn't seem especially problematic. I've been very objective, right, in what I've said. I've acknowledged its strengths and weaknesses, right? So you can acknowledge just weaknesses, like in that sample issue, or you can acknowledge just strengths and still be objective. All right, how about inquiry? Inquiry is a wonderful thing, and it's essential in this class. You have to have a sort of curious mind. What does it mean to inquire?
Ask questions about
Good. Ask questions. And in particular, ask questions for which you don't know the answers. And to look for answers in research, right? So you want to adopt a sort of curious mind with some of these issues, right? There's a tendency when we're researching a topic, especially if it's one that's maybe a little bit more controversial, to really want to find the answer that we want, right? We want to find someone who thinks exactly like we do, and we hope that they're really credible, and that we can use them as a sort of closer in our argument. But at the same time, it's important to be curious, to look for possibilities, that there's another way of thinking about things, and keeping your mind open in that way and continually asking questions will help you get to 10 pages. Realistically, without inquiry, it's very difficult to get to 10 pages. If all you have is statement, belief, you won't get to 10 pages, right? It's very efficient to just say what is. Unfortunately, very few things are that simplistic. All right, so this is the sort of skill set that we're working on. We'll get to argumentation later. You don't really have to argue in this first assignment. Let's take a little look at that assignment. Questions about any of this before we look at the first assignment? How many of you learned something today, even if it's just a sliver of a little part of a little minor pothole? Okay, that's good. I think it was